Hi, everyone, and welcome to this AXELOS Global Best Practice live stream. I'm your host, Akshay Anand, and boy, do we have an absolutely fabulous panel for you today. Probably the best panel we've ever put together. We're going to be talking about some fairly contentious things and violently agree with one another. But hopefully along the way, we'll have some friendly debates and arguments. And I do note that some people have already put in questions on the LinkedIn event. So if you're one of them, brilliant. Kudos to you. Thank you for doing that. But we do have people who are going to be looking at the chat function or the comments function in YouTube. So if you do have questions that come up as we discuss the topic of change enablement, change management, or change control, change management, then pop it in the chat, and those will be fed to me in the background, and we'll pick a few of those and we'll try to get through them. So without further ado, let's get to some introductions. As I said, I'm your host. My name is Akshay Anand. I'm the product ambassador for ITIL. I've been at AXELOS come 5 years in September, actually. Joined at the very early stages of the ITIL update, back when we were calling it ITIL X. We weren't sure what it was going to be named yet, so that's how far back I go. But joining me are some friends from around the world. You've no doubt seen them at various conferences and forums online. And I will go east to west this time round, and I think I know my geography properly. So the first person would be Sandeep Singh, sometimes known as Sunny, who works with the co-op. He is the lead technology service owner, leading a team that's responsible for service management and support of digital products within the co-op, such as mobile apps, the website, and so on. Broadly speaking, he's been in service management for over 12 years across various roles, from support, ITSM vendor consulting, leading on service strategy and design back in the day. But off late, he's been working a lot with product teams, with DevOps teams and Agile teams. In fact, he and I did a joint presentation at Atlassian Teams 21 about how the co-op used Jira Service Manager, ITIL 4's guiding principles, and the change enablement practice to deliver some real quantifiable and frankly astounding changes for various digital teams at the co-op. So, Sunny, welcome to the show, I suppose.
Thanks, Akshay.
And moving westwards from there, I think the next person is going to be Jennifer Papworth, if my geography is correct. So Jennifer works at Societe Generale, and she's a veteran service management leader who has a couple of decades worth of experience in IT operations, service management implementation projects, support, product ownership, even dabbling in things like policy and process development across finance as well as telco. I met Jennifer a few months ago, and we got talking about the role of Societe Generale in the world of finance. And I always thought of Societe Generale as an investment bank first and foremost. And she and others corrected me to the extent that I've realized that Societe Generale is one of those companies that can be regarded as the backbone of global financial infrastructure. Literally an entity that moves billions, if not trillions, in currency on a daily basis. So I thought that having those insights from that perspective about the risk, the tolerance towards risk, the appetite towards risk would be a really amazing thing to have, balancing off Sunny's cool kids, we move fast, break everything perspective. But Jennifer is also looking at how to incorporate change enablement and change enablement good practice, I should say, working across different teams who are all working in different ways. So no doubt we'll hear some really interesting insights from her. And last, but certainly not least, all the way on the other side of the world, or the west coast of America, is Greg Sanker. Greg is a former CIO. He's very active on the international speaking circuit as well. The author of a few books on the topic of technical change management or change enablement more generally. He and I have had really long conversations about change enablement, DevOps, governance, management of risk, and everything in between. He is actually one of the prime contributors to the change enablement practice in ITIL 4. And just to give you an idea of the magnitude of the change he had, I know it sounds simplistic, but he was the one who introduced the concept of change should be part of the value stream, not sitting outside of that. And the moment the bulb went off in all our heads as lead architects, we're like, oh my God, this is so powerful. We've got to build this into every single practice and every single bit of literature we write after this. So Greg has been at the core of ITIL 4 and helping shape a lot of what we've written and published in the past couple of years. So Greg, welcome to the show as well.
Thanks for having me. This is going to be fun.
It is. Maybe you'll play a few strings, a few bars of Winds of Change by the Scorpions at the end of it, just to play us out or something. Yes. I tried, but nice. I couldn't learn the song in time. Anyway, let's start by talking about what is a change. There's a lot of different opinions about this. There's a lot of different definitions and understanding. Greg, I'll probably come to you first. Maybe we'll do this in reverse order of geography, but as an author in the subject of change enablement, how have you approached describing, defining, explaining the concept of a change?
So that's not as easy as you would think, as I think everybody here on the broadcast knows, because a change is a change. Anything that changes is a change, right? And in the old days, we used to say, well, if it's something that's under change control or configuration management, well, then it's a change if you're making a change. So more generally, we kind of defined it as any addition, modification, or removal of anything that could potentially impact the service. And it's intended to be a broad and comprehensive definition because for different organizations, that can be different things.
Could I stop you there and just ask you to elaborate on one word you said there, the change of a thing. So when you talk about a thing, are we talking about a piece of infrastructure, code? Are we talking about roles and responsibilities and teams? What are we talking about? What is the thing?
Yep, that's exactly where I was going to go. Because
you fed me that. I had to go for it. Come on.
Yeah, nice. Because it could be argued that your lead interface engineer going on holiday is a change that could materially impact your service delivery. Certainly, introduction of a new piece of technology or an upgrade of a system. And these are all normal, I shouldn't say normal, these are all changes that we all recognize as probably ought to be managed in some sort of way. But, redundant power feeds into your data center, geographic changes with where data centers are in the case of cloud services. These are all get a little bit interesting, but when you get down to documentation associated with release versions and those microscopic things, it may not be worth the effort to track those things, even though they could potentially impact your service. And so you have to draw a risk-based line somewhere within your organization, and it's different for every organization. That's why we went with a more subjective kind of definition. It wasn't to be vague. It was to allow it to be instructive within any organization.
Okay. So maybe I'll jump off of that to you, Jennifer. So as you consider in the role you're in, defining what a change is for your organization, is a change something that is a modification that's ready to be deployed? The change is ready to happen. That's when you call it a change? Or do you go back to perhaps how previous versions of ITIL describe change, where change was really, a twinkle in somebody's eye that needed to then be justified, invested, funded, and so on? How do you define changes at Société Générale?
So we and I think most of the big ITSM tools and most companies have been making the assumption that the change is the last point. It's where you're ready for deployment, where you're on the point of updating an operational system. So you're adding a database table or releasing some code or updating a firewall rule. So it's really now boiling down to recording the operational change that you're about to make or the functional change that you're about to make. What I think we're missing, and you hit on this, is that we should be considering the whole change pipeline. So from the point it's a twinkle in somebody's eye, we should be planning and managing the change all the way along that life cycle. considering what are the dependencies, what are the impacts, what are the subtasks that need to happen. So if it were up to me, I would define change in a much broader manner, more like an epic or a user story in Agile, rather than kind of the deployment subtask, which I think it's been boiled down to in the tools today.
Okay, that's interesting. I do have a thought about that, but I do want to come back with to Sunny with that same question. In your experience, whether at the co-op or outside of that, where do you land on this topic about what is a change?
I think that's really interesting one, actually, and it probably depends on the context of your organization and also how they define change. I think for me, I'd like to sort of agree with Jennifer and see it broader than at the time of deployment, because I think getting closer to the sort of inception or the thinking of that change and getting really into the value stream of when it begins and the idea of when it's formed. I think for me, that's at the point when actually the idea of the change sort of starts, but actually the deployment of the change or the modification of code, software, the production environment, the service, for me probably actually happens at the time of deployment. So I guess that's not really a succinct answer as to which side I'm on. I guess I'm somewhere in the middle, because it really does depend on your definition.
Okay. There's one interesting thing that I've seen. I think I do agree with Jennifer that a lot of organizations that I've worked with or spoken to do boil down that definition down to the point of the actual deployment, because they would look at all the work that happened upstream as being either part of a project or as part of a sprint. So they don't necessarily associate it with change management or change enablement. They don't consider that work as being part of the change. The change is the operational activity of executing that modification. But I think you can extend it further and further upstream. To your point, Sonny, I think it's really amazing to think about it in terms of value streams, where the actual point of deployment is perhaps one of the last steps that you're doing, but there's all this upstream work. And if you consider the flow of work as a value stream, you can actually look at where are the constraints, where are the bottlenecks, where are the enablers to that flow of work. So I definitely think that we do need to extend the concept of a change back out upstream, for sure.
And just thinking about that a little bit further, actually, I'd say the most common sort of examples I'm used to is at the point of the production deployment. So especially with our digital teams, you'll have all the code ready in its pipelines and it's gone through its dev test environments, and it's all been kind of assured to go ahead and be released. And I think that's at the point that we commonly refer to it as, okay, now we're ready to deploy the change. And it's usually when we talk about it is when it's actually ready to go into production.
Greg, I'll come to you with I love tossing the easy ones to you, Greg.
Thanks.
But you actually wrote about this on your blog, which for those of you in the audience, ITSM Transition, wonderful website, wonderful blog, lots of great insights there. But Greg, you wrote a piece back in October 2019, or thereabouts, I think, about the change to the name of the practice. And we moved very quickly, I think, from, in ITIL version 3, it was called Change Management. We renamed it in the first iteration of ITIL 4 to Change Control, because we were trying to talk about controlling the rates of change, and that ran into some problems, and we quickly pivoted to calling it Change Enablement. So on that spectrum of labels, for lack of a better word, where do you fall? How do you think about it? Is it managing a change, controlling rate of change? Is it enabling change?
Well, I actually I'm gonna give the weasel answer. Is like they all apply. It's a matter of where you're providing your focus. Sandeep mentioned something I think is profoundly important. And let me just background just a little bit. If you look at the ITIL 2011 guidance, CAB is engaged, or change management proper is engaged 5 distinct points. We only think about that last point where it's like, okay, all the work is done. Now let's do change. That was never the intention. Change is the entire, from the twinkling of the eye to a fully deployed and producing value for the business. That's the breadth of change. The question then is, where do you need help? Where do you need assistance? Where can change management versus release or deployment or automated pipelines and all these other things? And so we're really starting to focus in on how do we integrate with product management, because some change decisions are part of the user story that's associated with, yes, that's going in the sprint. So you've already made a change decision. And so rather than act like we're going to supersede that or right on top of those things that are built into the pipeline, we have to be looking at, well, what outcomes do we need to make sure that are there? And in certain pipelines, this is kind of where we're going with the Agile DevOps CI/CD kind of thing, is how do we tie into the pipelines as they exist to ensure that the organization's change outcome expectations are being met and not weigh them down with an inspection point. You guys all know that Deming said, nearly, decades ago, he said that we got to stop relying on mass inspection. That's what CAB is at the end of a development cycle. You're just simply saying, let's just quick review, let's make sure everything is good before we let it into production. And you really can't add value there. All you can do is take away value. Don't let that change go into production, which theoretically has value, but you're not actually adding anything. So my perspective is that change management needs to back off and become an oversight or a governance function that literally says, is everything that's happening in the value stream producing the outcome expectations that are needed? If so, we've done our job. Let's go, back to it's like a pit stop for Formula One, 1.8 seconds, right? It's like the minimum effective change control is what we want to go for. Mostly we want to be operating at speed, pipeline speed.
Well, I think part of that is also recognizing that you don't necessarily need an external change authority. Going back to the point I made during the intro, integrating change work into the value stream is a very powerful concept. I remember 5-6 years ago making the argument that if I'm doing my end of sprint demo or review with my business stakeholders who have sponsored and authorized the work and help me write my stories and epics and so on, well, that's effectively my CAB. I don't need to go to another group of people who know nothing about the change that's happening when I've got all my relevant stakeholders right here every 2 weeks. So I think a lot of it is about also devolving responsibility to the right places as well. So it is as light touch as possible, and you're using the existing structures and scaffolding of the organization to meet your outcomes. But let's talk about why we actually manage changes or enable changes. Jennifer, what has been your experiences? What are the benefits that you commonly talk about when you talk about the role that you provide, or the role that your team provides and the outcome it provides? What are the sort of things that you're helping the organization with?
So, as a bank, it's a mandate. We have to be able to evidence every change that we have made to production, to the live systems. So we have to record every change that's made for audit purposes, and we have to have good data because we will get challenged by internal and external auditors if the data is not good. Now, from a change owner's perspective, that's pretty boring. That's the paperwork, that's the bureaucracy, but it's a fact of life in the financial industry and many others. Where I think we bring more value in the CAB, or, depending on your setup, change managers, change owners, devolved CABs, is identifying and resolving scheduling conflicts with other planned operations. If you completely devolve change management to individual teams, by default, they will not coordinate with each other. So that does usually take some central coordination. For example, you might want to avoid major platform changes in the run-up to a resiliency test, or make sure that a vendor team isn't spread too thin on a given day, doing too many changes. Validate that all the conditions are in place to not cause an incident. So has it been tested? Have you got your deployment steps actually documented? And have you thought about a rollback plan? And at what point you'll take that decision to fix forward or roll back? if you have a central function, they're trained to ask the right questions about dependencies and risks, so impact to downstream systems and processes, user testing needs. As we were discussing earlier, and I think we all agreed, these are questions that should be asked up front in the change project and not at the last minute, but worst case, it's something you can catch during the final review. And a key point is that given arguably, most incidents are caused by changes. If you're properly recording the change that you make, what you're making it to, and when you're making it, then if you do have an incident, you can quickly look up what changed, who do I need on the call, where's the rollback procedure, should I fix forward, should I roll back? So there's a number of, I mean, it's a big discipline, it's a big practice, but I think over and above the bureaucracy that it's come to be associated with for various good and bad reasons, there's a lot of value to paying attention to your changes and properly managing them.
Well, to the point about asking these questions at the start of the change, I would suppose you'd need to ask the question again at different stages, because as we evolve, as we're evolving the solutions that we're deploying, you could expect certain constraints to go away, new ones to be introduced, certain risks to go away, new ones to be. So I suppose it does make sense to revisit those same sort of questions at regular intervals, perhaps.
Yeah, I mean, you can do it in different ways. You can automate many of these checks. Ideally, you can make it part of your definition of done. Speaking about application releases, but yes, it's not enough to ask once at the start and then not check that risk was mitigated or that dependency was addressed.
Fair enough. And Sonny, Jennifer covered a lot of ground there. Do you agree, disagree, maybe a slightly different take on things? Where do you stand on?
I agree, but again, I think it depends on the types of changes and the business that you're dealing with. Certainly from my experience, what I would say is, from a perception perspective, I don't think we manage changes. I definitely see us as enabling changes or controlling the flow of change. I think a lot of the management side of things, of the actual changes, especially in the sort of software field, DevOps field, and kind of where we've got that risk and impact assessment, is built into the automation itself. So it's early on in the pipeline, and a lot of that, automation is making sure we've got the checks and balances in place to assess risk and impact. So our job as devolved change teams, let's call us, who are kind of working with these product teams, is to ensure that we are making our changes safe, but also fast. So I think it's balancing that high velocity with ensuring we retain stability of our services and making sure that we do things safely. So probably my take and perspective on it is that as change managers, we are more focused on how can we enable our business to go faster to meet our business outcomes and kind of, I suppose, be happy with our change success factors. And I think that's the key for us in our teams as to why we manage or enable change.
It's a fair point. And Greg, Jennifer touched upon use the B word, bureaucracy, right?
Sorry.
I think one of the common frustrations that we hear a lot is, change management was slow to evolve back in the day. We still hear complaints about the cab, which you talked about. Why do you think that we are in the place we're at? And equally, how do you think we might be able to? How can change management dig itself out of that hole?
Yeah, and I think part of the answer is, Jennifer, I wish because I've been a very vocal advocate for change management is part of your governance, risk, and compliance, and being able to produce what I call audit grade evidence of the elements. The NIST 853 framework demands certain activities associated with changes. And until version 5, that was just less than a year ago, it literally said this group will perform these functions with regard to change. It literally specified that. So if NIST 853 was on your to-do list, you had to do that. You had to be able to demonstrate that you did that. Now, the updated guidance simply says must happen, doesn't say by whom or how it's actually carried out. And that's part of the challenge that we face. Many of you know that Dr. Forsgren is a vocal DevOps thought leader, and perhaps her most memorable saying is, and at the DevOps Enterprise Summit in 2018, she said cabs are useless. And a room full of DevOps are just laughing. And then she went on to say it doesn't have a material impact on failed change rates or recovery from failed changes. And it's like, well, she's right. But she's also ignoring a massive body of work that is typically fulfilled by cabs or other forms of change management, which are important to organizations. You don't go to a financial institution and say, stop doing change management. You don't need to. The question is, how do we ensure that these outcome expectations, the ability to evidence that every change is being done consistently and appropriately and who authorized and so on and so forth, the question becomes, how do we do that in a more streamlined and efficient manner? So that change has definitely earned a reputation. And like I mentioned before, is we focus so much as change on the power that's embodied in the cab that, yes, no, you can go, denied, all that sort of stuff, which certainly was a take on the guidance, but it was never the form that it was actually intended to. And many organizations, as far back as 25 years ago, were doing a much more devolved, that's a new term for me, a devolved change management, where we're working with people. The whole idea is like, we're working together to produce these outcomes. So we don't need to be creating a change management silo. But the other piece that I wanted to add actually is something that you highlighted in the setup here. And I've said this for years. If change management is a process through which changes are evaluated for risk, et cetera, then all changes have to go through the process. Otherwise, you're bypassing the process. If it's a process, inputs, activities, outputs. But if it's an organizational practice or a capability, then they can work in collaboration with other parts of the value chain and value streams to ensure that those things are being brought about. And as such, it is actually one of the feedback loops that we talk so much about in DevOps. It provides real-time information so that you can make real-time risk-based assessments on what do we need to do with this change or changes like this based on historic information about change outcome performance. And that's where things start becoming really streamlined. There is no reason that we can't be doing effective change enablement and doing DevOps CI/CD and traditional change delivery at the speed that we've been doing it, or we would like to do it.
I don't mean to make light of anybody's struggles over the last 5-10 years in this field, but I sometimes do wonder whether we've collectively suffered from a lack of good communication, because I see one of the core functions of service management as being that communicator, that enabler, the mediator across multiple stakeholders, and that's certainly how I've approached the work that I've done over the years. And I've seen a number of organizations where service management failed to translate or adequately translate the concerns at the sort of risk management level, corporate risk or enterprise risk management level, and saying, if we have to be able to manage these sorts of risks, this is how we need to be able to manage changes. And equally say, well, those risks aren't valid anymore or not have been mitigated because of the way these guys are doing things, but they're also doing these other things which can maybe create new risks up here which are not being recognized. And so I wonder whether sometimes there's a communication breakdown. I mean, I invoked the Scorpions in the titling of this, so now let me invoke Led Zeppelin. I wonder if there's a communication breakdown, translating corporate or enterprise risk down to operational teams, and also going back the other way around. Any thoughts, any comments? Is this something that, open question to the panel, is this something that you've seen in your work?
So I think, if I may actually, I think for me, where I've noticed these sort of struggles in the past and from my experience, you probably need to understand what your organization's, I suppose, appetite is for risk. And that definitely isn't communicated from, let's say, the top down all the way through into these operational policies and procedures. So you might have actually at top level, the organization wants to be risk averse because that's just the way they are and that's the way they think. So what tends to happen is then the communication of that gets passed down, flowed through to the operational teams, and that's how they may respond and behave, I suppose. So I think that's where the theme, or I should say that the tone of change management really starts, and probably like we don't see enough of that consistency throughout the organization. So I always talk about that if you're going to have a policy or a process procedure, they should really flow throughout your organization and kind of all be in tune with each other. And I think we've probably struggled with that in organizations I've definitely seen. So as a result, you end up with kind of different ways of working and probably not the things that was first intended.
Fair enough. I was also chatting with somebody earlier today, and I was saying that in some cases, organizations have very good short-term memory and very good long-term memory, but very poor in the sort of medium-term memory, which by which I mean, people remember the stuff that broke last week, and they'll remember stuff that broke 2 decades ago, and they'll base all their decisions on their experience from 2 decades ago. Greg probably remembers this, but I remember chatting with him once and saying, the way I see it the evolution of this space is, back in the day, we used to literally ship software. We would burn it onto floppy drives and put it in boxes and literally ship those boxes everywhere. And if something was wrong with the code, with the piece of equipment that you'd ship, the cost of recall was astronomical, financial, reputational, etc. So the risk profile of the company, the risk appetite of the company reflected that. But as we invest in new technologies, new ways of working, a lot of those risks have now been mitigated, but the organization still remembers these risks from 20 years ago and still bases their decisions on that sort of corporate memory. The elephant never forgets sort of syndrome. But how do we move past this? How do we create that feeling of collaboration, the spirit of collaboration? How do we embed this into our teams? What has worked for you guys? And Sonny, I'll come to you first, if you don't mind, since you volunteered to answer the last question. I'll come back to you.
Well, this might be slightly controversial, but I think it starts with trust. And I think what you've just explained there is because if you've had a lot of incidents and a lot of issues as a result of kind of changes going wrong, then I suppose your appetite to risk changes and your level of governance that you apply also changes with that. I know with our teams on the journey that we went through, we were saying, well, actually, we should allow our teams and enable them to be able to make changes. And if they do go wrong, give them the tools and equipment to be able to learn from those very quickly, roll back very quickly. And actually, the impact to our services is minimal because probably it takes longer for a change to go wrong than it does to roll back and repair it, right? So actually, what is that impact in kind of customer terms? Probably minimal, and it's actually not even viewed to the customer. So why are we kind of not going down this route and down this journey? So I think for us, and especially for me, it was a big learning curve of traditional ITSM going into this modern way of working is let's start with trust and build that communication with our engineers, with our application teams, and they're the ones who are closest to do the change, so they understand it really well, and they also know what to do when they don't go as planned, and they're able to kind of put some really good mitigation plans in place. So we start to build that over time, and I think that's probably why we're in a much more mature space in this area.
Would it be fair to say that the role of the change manager has now shifted from the hygiene checker to more like a coach, where you're coaching teams on learning from those failed changes, recovering from them, so that these risks do not manifest again? Would it be fair to say?
Absolutely, yeah. Definitely more a facilitator, more a coach, more an enabler, because rather than just sort of being this last stage gate, as Greg pointed, kind of the entry to go live, which is probably what we were perceived as fill this RFC in, we'll have a look at it. In fact, we probably didn't even understand some of the detail on there because we're not technical. So why don't we apply our skills and add value in a different way? And I think that's definitely where our role as change managers in these product teams has definitely provided value, because we are now able to look at the process and the tooling that's been used, look at the pipelines, inspect to make sure we've got things like segregation of duties, 2-key deployment, and all these other kind of controls that can be automated, and improving that, learning from failure, holding change implementation reviews when things don't go well, post-implementation reviews, learning from failure, improving things. So that's kind of, I think, where we definitely add most value.
Fair point. Jennifer, same question to you, if I may. How have you been sort of coaching your teams, engaging with the wider group of stakeholders, moving into that spirit of collaboration and trust, but at the same time balancing your sort of enterprise risk concerns.
Yeah, so I fully agree with Sunny, and you touched on the automation point. So that's been one big enabler. If we can make a Jira version or an infrastructure request automatically become a record of the change with all the right evidence attached, then the change owner saves a lot of time on copy pasting. We get away from manual inspection, hygiene checks to make sure the fields are filled out, and that frees the change owners up to really manage their changes and their deployments, and us up to further automate or act as a coach. Bit of a shout out to Greg's blog posts on killing the cab. There's some good ideas there about, helping a central function can help teams identify what changes can be standardized. So many changes are repetitive. They don't need a review every time they happen. Repetitive and low risk. Identify good candidates. If you can automate 50% and up of your changes that your organization is making as standard changes. Another good technique is to identify which teams, which systems are correctly managing their changes and exempt them from manual inspection. Maybe you do an audit once in a while to make sure that they're still compliant. But where it's not needed, it helps to have central functions focus their attention on the teams that are still struggling with the change process, having high levels of incidents, not understanding how to properly prepare their changes. And the other thing is just to provide some of the central value I was speaking about earlier, so identifying and resolving dependencies and conflicts. But again, automation, AI is a key. You can use machine learning to flag changes that are likelier to cause issues and need manual review. You can use automation to coordinate some of those dependencies, identify the best window for your deployment to maximize your chances of success. So there's a lot of things we can do in change management whilst moving away from the old model of a hygiene check. I like that you called it that, actually. I think that sums it up.
Yeah.
Greg, I'm going to come to you with a slightly different question. As you know, I love to toss you the easy ones, right?
Yes, I know.
So if we were to look at, these sort of engineering teams, platform teams, there's a few nodes, a few connections, few relationships. It's easier to manage the change across those few nodes and those few relationships. But once we start to scale up from that, you're adding more and more nodes, more and more stakeholders, more and more relationships. Sometimes you might be dealing with, as part of a larger program, certain changes are being delivered by a third party, for example. How do you reconcile these sort of larger changes or techniques for these larger changes with the need for speed? God, I'm like going all 80s here, right?
Yeah, that's awesome.
How do you reconcile that with like the need for speed and all the other good stuff?
Yeah, I see. I was all prepared to answer something else. Okay, so here's, and then that's why you love doing that to me. Here's the things that I think apply to this is if you think about this, just zoom back out and just look at the large scale. If you look at the traditional CAB approach to managing changes, the presumption is that the systems and the changes are relatively simple when you think about a complexity framework. Dave Snowden, Cynefin, et cetera. I'm not going to even try to go into that. But the idea that you can look at it, ask some questions, and say, oh, okay, this is low risk. Or at most, you go into a complicated frame where you say, with some expertise, CAB traditionally, we pull in the experts, you look at it, you ask tough questions, you dig in really, really deep, and that gives us the ability to make some decisions based on it. But again, we're making some certain assumptions that in many cases are no longer true. Our systems are incredibly complex, and they don't operate like simple or even complicated systems. They are complex. And one of the things that you learn from the study of complexity is if you apply the wrong approaches to the situation that you're in, you will get bad results. One of the things that a CAB traditionally does is it treats all changes as if they're simple or complicated, and we're not recognizing that we're managing complex adaptive systems. So that's number one. We've got to adapt what we're doing to match the systems that we're doing. So as Jennifer points out, in some cases, you have, every gig I've had in the last 15 years, there's been mainframe that is doing things like general ledger, et cetera, right? So those kind of changes are traditionally handled as simple changes and can benefit from a review board of some sort of thing, probably delegated, but certainly a review. But when you're doing multi-vendor cloud, infrastructure as a service and levels and levels of complexity, that just doesn't work anymore. So we have to adapt to other things that we're doing. The other thing that Sunny pointed out is some failure is actually good. I'm taking your thought and extending a little bit, but I had a life-changing moment when I started taking a serious study of this concept of anti-fragile. And I thought about, oh my gosh, I've been part of the problem, because as a change manager, it's like no changes, no failed changes. We must not have failed changes in production. That's bad. That's always bad. But as changes have increasingly shrunk down to these tiny little things and are back those out nearly instantaneously, the risk that we're inducing is we don't really truly understand our systems. That's a risk that we're not mitigating by saying, whoa, hang on, let's investigate this. And so some amount of failure is actually good. And that's why we need to create safe to fail spaces, or understand what the blast radius is associated with the changes that you're managing, and let some failure go through. Chaos engineering, chaos monkey, those are all things where we try to induce failure into systems so that we better understand how they work and we better understand how to manage them. Why? Because the outcome that we're trying to achieve in change is stable, reliable, predictable systems that are producing a certain level of measured risk for the organization. It doesn't say that we have to inspect that. It says we have to achieve that.
Okay, so I am going to be difficult for the sake of being difficult,
awesome,
Greg, because you again fed me this. All right, and I'm actually going to reference a conversation I had with the CEO of a medical tech firm. His big issue is, if I've got a pacemaker attached to somebody's heart and I push the wrong deployment, guess what's going to happen?
Yes,
right.
So,
I know. So some failure is acceptable.
Well, so thank you. That's awesome. So I'm going to quickly devolve. My father had a pacemaker and was in the emergency room. And what the cardiologist eventually said is, wow, one, the pacemaker wasn't properly detecting the heartbeat. So it had no idea whether your heart was going or not. And two, the trigger level of the pulse that it sent out was sufficiently low that even if it knew your heart wasn't beating, it wouldn't trigger it, i.e. let's reprogram this thing, right? So that kind of failure. So I know people that work in the nuclear industry, and this individual that I talked to, and I'm not going to name him obviously, but they work in the nuclear field, is they must be able to reproduce the configuration of every system that's produced any piece of evidence for any regulatory decisions for as far back as the organization goes. He said, Greg, you don't understand change management. This is crazy, crazy stuff where we have to understand the minutia of every system at every point in time. So when you're doing that, or when you're doing aerospace engineering or military contracting, or I have a friend that works in air traffic control and their systems can never be updated, and yet they have to always be up to date. When is it okay to bring down an air traffic control system? Never. Lives depend on it, right? So that requires a different level of understanding change management. Some risk still, or some failure still, is probably helpful for the resiliency of the system that you're operating on. But you can't operate in this imprecision. Like, well, what's the worst that can happen? We can recover in 5 minutes. Well, in 5 minutes the patient is dead. In 5 minutes you've launched a nuke. In 5 minutes airplanes have collided. So that doesn't apply there. But when you're a video streaming service or a digital service provider, and as Sunny pointed out, is like, if you've carefully engineered your changes, your release, your infrastructure, changes are so small, is most likely they won't be noticed, and our ability to pull them back out is very, very limited. And that's why we talked about, I've started talking about blast radius, which is not a unique thought to me, but how much is at risk with this change? when there's lives, when there's critical infrastructure, military governments, et cetera, it's like you have to operate differently than if it's one feature of one part of one system, and our ability to recover is measured in seconds and not hours. It's a very different, and so we have to be adaptive. So I envision a change capability that, all the way from your flagship product that where you're moving, you're delivering 1,200 changes a day, all the way down to a mainframe application that's doing financial transactions where it's highly regulated, and it's adaptive to the value streams that are serving those.
That's a good answer. I might ask you to write this up in a forthcoming blog post. We've had a ton of questions, and although I know I'd sent out a run sheet where we said we'd share some tips and so on, I think we've already done that. I think we've shared some very practical guidance for our listeners. So I'm going to start with the questions that were submitted on LinkedIn, and then my colleague Rasha has been feeding me some of the questions from the YouTube chat. So we'll see how we get along, and we'll try to get through as many as we can. Ankita asks, how do we define business readiness in an agile environment? And Sunny, if you don't mind, I'll toss that question to you. How do you think about business readiness in an agile environment?
Ooh, that's a tough one. That so business readiness. What do we mean by that? What do we think we mean by that?
I think it's I suppose, how do we introduce a concept of production support readiness? Back in the day, we used to have these operational checklists and all those sorts of things.
Yeah.
So how would we define that this is ready for the business? This will, I guess, the difference between change, deploy, and release also sort of factors into it a little bit.
Yeah, again, I'll go by sort of our experience or my experience. We probably go more into the service transition world around that, and looking at the things like service readiness checklists is what we have. So that's just a lean, cut down version of what these are the things that we need in place for our business to be able to accept these agile changes. And what I mean by that is actually incremental changes, what things are being changed, introducing a sort of heartbeat approach to that. So rather than sort of waiting for the end of this long project and then thinking about, okay, have we got all of the things ready for service and support, right? We're doing that kind of continuously. So I guess I'd refer to that as almost continual service transition or continual service readiness, just making sure that our business is ready to support these changes, and what's the impact on them going to be. So whether that's updating your support models, your service level agreements, your supplier relationships, it's not something that's just done as a one-off activity. So to answer the question, I think you've got to be able to modify your practices and processes to be in tune with the speed of agility. Because if you're not, you're probably going to miss out on things. So you're going to have this big bang sort of approach at the end, which is what we want to avoid.
So kind of like what we were talking about with Jennifer earlier, it's about asking the same question at different regular intervals through the life cycle of that change. Sorry, Jennifer, didn't mean to speak over you.
Yeah, sorry to interrupt. I was just pointing out that, Sunny's basically saying that this is where it touches the 4 ITIL dimensions. So when you're making, even if it just looks like a technical change, you need to consider the engagement required from or the impact to your partners and suppliers, the information that you're maintaining about the system, the people. So, I mean, I think of business readiness as, are the end users trained? Do they know how to use it? Is any documentation that they use up to date? And as Sunny was saying, is the support process up to date, the support information up to date, the monitoring? So that's something that in the past has been managed by a last minute checklist, but needs to be part of the change pipeline.
Absolutely. No, that good shout out to think about things in 4-dimension terms as well. So I'll come to you with the second question then, Jennifer. Vernon asks, we're about to revisit our change practice. What is the one thing we should make sure we do, and what is the one thing we should definitely avoid?
So I think we covered a good do not earlier, which was don't make the CAB a generic paperwork exercise. Focus on where it can provide value and what things can be exempt from the CAB, either by standardization or by federating, devolving your change management responsibilities and automating as far as possible. So focus on how can it bring the most value, not how can it introduce the most barriers to change. One thing I would do is, I mean, knowing changes can and do cause incidents, but as we were discussing, CI/CD, continuous delivery, is a good thing where we're releasing incremental, smaller improvements that are less likely to have a large blast radius. Focus on streamlining and automating your testing, your operational readiness steps, your deployment steps. And if you do have incidents, don't be scared. Just plan ahead to reduce the impact and duration of those incidents by automating your detection and rollback mechanisms. So there's a lot that you can do through, going full speed ahead with smaller changes and automating the pipeline as far as possible.
That's brilliant. I love that response. Thank you. Greg, I'll come to you with the next one then. Dustin asks, or says, I've seen where ITIL talks about change enablement and request management as separate items. We handle requests using the change management process in our ESM tool. Does the panel consider that requests should be processed differently from changes? And explain why. So if I had to boil that down, I would say what he's asking for is, are requests separate from changes, or are they a subset of changes?
I think, well, the answer to that is tricky, because it really depends on the context of the organization. From a best practices, or from a generic sense, some requests are a service delivery that aren't necessarily a change, or they may be a standard change. So it's not really necessarily a change that we're all that interested in from a change management perspective. But from another sense is any request that requires a change to the infrastructure, as we've defined earlier, or as an organization defines it, then that is the funnel that's into change management. Change management typically is viewed as supporting whatever activities are underpinning other activities, service delivery, et cetera. But I think where you're probably going with this is not that. And the answer I gave you is fairly process-centric. And I would encourage you to zoom back and look more about what outcomes you're trying to achieve. The context in which I think requests are tied to changes is when the requests are service enhancement requests. I would like to add this feature. I would like to add this. And in those cases, that's normally your development pipeline, where there is the users are asking for this feature or that feature or the other feature. And how you do that is really more about how you manage changes to your products that you're using. So it's more like, is it a project, or is it a product? Is there a product team? Is it a business derived team? Is there a product owner that's doing that in whatever practices you are? So when we zoom back and put change enablement as a practice, as it's properly located within ITIL, it facilitates all of those things being delivered effectively, but it doesn't stand in the way. It doesn't inject itself into the value stream or the pipeline and demand that things flow through it. And so that's where it's a very subjective question. I will add, and I'll add to Jennifer's comments about what do we do and what do we not do with change management, is don't presume that change management has to have a tight grip on everything that passes through. Change management can watch it go through and say, looks like everything is working great. Here's some feedback for you to improve your practice, but we don't have to interject.
It's a fair point. I think there's one more scenario in which I can definitely see a strong link between requests and change. And again, this is, I think, going back to first principles or first definitions. A request is typically against something that a set of activities or set of outputs that has been defined previously and can be seen to be consistently delivered to the exact same quality and so on. And you can definitely see a request for a new server, a new test environment, a new piece of infrastructure on your platform, which you would want to track as a change to the platform itself, so that you can do your incident reviews or incident analysis and problem investigations and so on. So I definitely see that as a strong link between requests and a change. How you choose to operationalize that, whether you call that a request ticket or a change ticket, I think that just comes down to context. Do you call it a shovel or a spade, right? At the end of the day, you're digging something up and moving it from spot A to spot B, right?
Yeah.
So Yeah, so that's what I'd say about that.
I think also, actually, sorry to interrupt, but the place to start with that is probably looking at your standard changes, because I think that's definitely, you know, Jennifer made a really great point earlier on about getting as many standard changes in as possible, and then actually analyze those and say, actually, which one of these could be requests, because we're currently going through that process right now, and you can, you know, make life so much more easy just by identifying which one of these could go into the request world.
Yeah, and I would add, I would usually tie exactly the way Sonny is suggesting there. I would usually tie it to a service catalog act where it's defined and it's requestable, and then the process for delivering it is defined, you know, is more under the water.
That's true. I will add to the ever-growing list of you know, what should be done and what shouldn't be done as well. And this goes applies to any of the practices in ITIL 4. It's not just to change enablement, but we have to recognize that that teams should absolutely be allowed to do the work in the way they see best to their context. So whether it's incident management, whether it's change enablement, the way that this platform engineering team does it should be different to the way a service desk agent does a similar type of work. It could be described in similar terms, but the work itself is very different. You might find different teams need to use different tools, different procedures, use different bits of information, you know, going back to the 4 dimensions model, which Jennifer highlighted as well. And that's absolutely fine. I think as long as there's a centralized system of record from which you can mine all the good, rich information about trends and stats and all that sort of stuff that you can float up to sort of influence your investment decisions, continual improvement decisions, and so on. So I'd say, you know, separate system of engagement or the work itself from the system of record. So that would be definitely a sort of a do and a don't. Don't it's not a one size fits all, but please do make sure you recognize and enable teams to work in different ways. We've got 5 minutes left, or 4 minutes, I think. I'm going to look for one more question. I hope I'm pronouncing this gentleman's name correctly. I hope it's a gentleman. Razlizam asks, one of our biggest challenges is to manage the change calendar. Does the panel have any tips and tricks about how to manage that calendar to avoid conflicts between major changes and minor changes? And I think, was it Jennifer? I think you were made the first reference to change calendar, so maybe I can come to you first with that question.
Yeah, I've actually been involved in projects at both of my most recent roles to try to tackle this problem. So I think the key principle is have all of your changes, and I know we can't call them events because in ITIL that means basically a monitoring alert, but you know, planned events, significant events. Pull them all into one place so that you have a consolidated list of everything that's happening and the infrastructure and applications that it impacts on what day, at what time, in what region. And then you need a tool, and unfortunately the standard ITSM tools don't seem to have evolved this functionality very far. Personally, I think we should have a significant event management practice in ITIL 5, but we'll get to that later. You need some system, whether it's manual or automated, to identify, you know, is this thing downstream or upstream of this other thing that wants to make a change? Are they going to be down at the same time? If not, go for it. So basically something that will analyze what are the impacts, what's the timing, and is there any conflict between these two changes or events or not? And you can use that also to help you identify good windows to schedule changes, as well as reviewing changes to see if they conflict with anything. I know many places do it manually, and that's fine for now until kind of the systems evolve with us. We're building one internally right now, but that won't help the majority of the audience here until the systems evolve to help us kind of better detect those conflicts up front.
Could I just, I know, Greg, you were just about to say something, but I do want to ask a follow-up question to that, Jennifer, if I may. And I'll use a very simplistic example of Outlook, right? There are times when in Outlook I will schedule an all-day busy event because I just need some time to think. I need, I'm working on something big and I just need to block out time on my calendar. But what that means is somebody who's looking for time to have a 15-minute discussion with me cannot find time because my calendar essentially says it's blocked out. The whole day is blocked out. So I think when we start to mix major changes or major programs of work with these sort of minor changes, isn't there a risk of these major change programs essentially steamrolling, if you will, over everything else, these sort of smaller changes? How is that something that you've encountered, and if so, how have you?
Absolutely. And in my last role, somebody actually produced a dashboard showing that in any of the 365 days a year, they were under a blackout and not allowed to move anything. So I think the answer is to not have it black and white, have it color coded, shades of green to red. So and Outlook does do that, to be fair. This slot seems more suitable because okay, there's technically a conflict because it's a minor change, or there's no conflict, or there's 3 conflicts in this slot versus 7 in the other slot. The other part of the solution is to have an override request function. So, can I go, and then perhaps a human, perhaps a bot will assess, is this safe? So can I book a meeting during Akshay's downtime? In some cases, yes, depends who I am, depends if he needs a break.
Fair enough. Greg, I jumped in there just as you were about to say something.
Well, Jennifer is like bringing the nuggets here. This is the good stuff, right? Here's where this starts getting really, really fun. I've been having a conversation with a CEO, and I won't tell you the company. You'll have to go do your searching, and he'll have to do his own marketing. But they are mining change data like I've not seen anybody do before. And the intelligence and the informed information that they're getting out of the historic data, even the things she was talking about of like, it depends on who's asking and it depends on the change, is historic change data and change outcomes can be understood by AI systems and really, truly assess of, your risk only goes up modestly with this kind of change being added to this change or being reflected, or this change being done at an end of month financial closing, or under these circumstances in the way that humans never could. And so I really strongly encourage the tools vendors to step up their game with using AI to help inform change managers and organization about the risk, but also change our thinking associated with it. The concept of a blackout or a change window is fairly tied to simple systems and not complex systems, but we don't have the tools and knowledge needed to execute that. And I'm going to yield time because we're at the end there.
We are. Sunny, just very quickly to you, any sort of closing thoughts based on what we were just discussing about managing change calendars? Is this
I mean, it's just a challenge we're also finding, and I think to Greg's point, that'll be music to my ears if we can get automation and AI involved to kind of help mining that change data. I'm going to reference one of the ITIL 4 guiding principles: start where you are, which is what we're doing. Start by putting things into an Outlook calendar and then kind of just evolve from that, really. So, we also do have multiple tool sets, and we are kind of struggling to kind of look at how do we consolidate those conflicts and making sure we've got one single view of change. So it's a journey, and just be mindful that it'll take time, and I think use the tools at your disposal.
Brilliant. So let's wrap it up there. I do recognize that we have a number of questions that we've not gotten to, and what we might look at doing is sending these questions out to the lovely panel and asking them if they can write a few sentences to quickly respond to these questions and then consolidate those responses and then publish them either as part of our AXELOS newsletter or maybe as a blog post, not quite sure yet. So if you haven't already, please do subscribe to the AXELOS newsletter. We may stick it in my ITIL as well, which is part of the AXELOS website. It's a sort of membership scheme, so it might be a nice little value-add nugget over there. So if you're part of my ITIL, you might see some bits of information, follow-up information pop up there as well. So it goes without saying, thank you so much to our lovely panel. Sunny, if people want to find you, get hold of you, talk about some of the things that you've shared today, what's the best way they can do that? Sonny?
Oh, I think I was just on mute there. Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Yeah, so LinkedIn, you can find me on LinkedIn or on Twitter, Sundeep Ensing. So yeah, I'm usually on all social platforms. So yeah, feel free to get in touch.
Brilliant. And Jennifer, if people want to find you and maybe discuss some of the things that you've shared today, what's the best way to get hold of you?
Yeah, same LinkedIn. But if you add me, please just put the reason for adding, because if there's no reason and I don't know you, I tend not to accept it.
A wise decision. I've had to do the same as well. And Greg, certainly you're no stranger to me, but you're probably no stranger to most people who are watching this stream. But in case there's that one person who doesn't know you, what's the best way they can get hold of you?
Probably LinkedIn. There, you mentioned my blog, and I'm GT Sanker on Twitter, and I'm pretty active usually.
Excellent. And if you want to get hold of me, it's at Blowboy on Twitter, although I am taking quite the extended Twitter break. If not, LinkedIn is the next best place. And just like Jennifer, if there's no reason, then I will automatically decline any and all invites. So if you do want to connect with me, more than happy to, but just add a quick note to that. Also, thank you to Harry, our lovely producer, and Gemma and Rasha from our marketing and social media team who've been monitoring things in the back end just to make sure everything's going smoothly. We hope to bring you more of these sorts of discussions, and if there are topics that you'd like us to cover, please do let us know by either our LinkedIn page, AXELOS LinkedIn page, or privately to myself. So, folks, until next time, please stay safe. If you're in a part of the world that needs you to wear masks, please wear a mask. And regardless of where you are in the world, please remember to wash your hands. Bye-bye.
Thank you.